Chapter 45. When the soldiers arrived at the abandoned factory Rip had chosen for their battle, they came in a careless and remarkably unprofessional manner. The building had once been part of a larger metalworking complex in the area. There were remains of other buildings scattered all about that had long since been torn down. Now only this one and a large warehouse nearby still stood. He had chosen the factory because it still contained all the original equipment. The warehouse, on the other hand, was simply packed full of everything that had been taken from the other buildings that had been destroyed. The owners of the land had started on the project of redeveloping the land. Then something had happened before they could auction everything off. The place had been stuck in a sort of limbo ever since. It was perfect for his purposes though, and if it all happened to burn down, well, he was sure the owners would actually thank him. Assuming they still had insurance on the place, that is. You wouldn't think a trained military squad would willingly follow a person into what amounted to an obvious trap. Yet here they were. At least they weren't stupid enough to simply drive their vehicles right up to the entrance of the old factory. No, they had stopped them at the entrance of the long overgrown driveway and were preparing to sneak into the woods. Rip was under no illusion that this would be easy, but they had made a serious mistake in letting him pick the battleground. It wasn't even just about having the home field advantage this time. It was in how they were approaching the entire fight. It was as though they thought he was less than them, that his training had been shit compared to theirs. There was one thing that they were forgetting, or possibly didn't even know, though that was doubtful. The life of a child soldier was worth less than the food they were given each day. That meant any training they received was far harsher than anything you would find in the military. Government organizations needed to keep their trained and supposedly expensive soldiers around. Terrorists had no such compunction towards children. They were there to be used and then thrown away. Harsh training where their lives were on the line was the norm. Perhaps the exercises weren't always the most effective, but that was par for the course. It was worse than most things sheltered, normal people could imagine going through on a constant daily basis. Death and broken bones were a fact of life, as were working through your injuries. Pain was your closest friend and your companion. It was the first thing you felt in the morning, and the last thing you felt before going to sleep at night. While Rip might not be as good as he used to be at ignoring it and welcoming its presence, he would still bet everything he had that he was better at working through his pain than your average soldier. He was willing to let his body be broken and injured to kill all these men. Could they say the same? Then there were his harsh days of training from back then. Before the attack in Indonesia, he had let that part of himself slip and fall into a deep slumber. Now it was awake again, and those skills were coming back to him. In the time since they'd gotten back, whenever he hadn't been exercising, working on the Airstream, or hanging out with Ashley, he had been training. His body ached, but it also felt more alive than it had in years. From his position under cover, he watched as 10 men climbed out of 3 SUVs. Each one was armed to the teeth and wearing body armor and night vision goggles. They might have been stupid to let him choose the location, but at least they knew to come fully kitted out. His current rifle was a .3006 bolt action with no suppressor on it. The extra noise would be annoying, but he wanted each shot at full power and not slowed in the slightest. Besides, how much good would a suppressor have done for this caliber anyway? The rifle was a modified Savage that he had picked up from the local plumber for a steal. Rip knew some people preferred the newer .308 cartridge over the older .3006 ammo. All he had to say to those people was that they were morons. Yes, the new caliber was almost as good, but almost didn't quite cut it sometimes. The .3006 produced more energy and velocity than the .308, not to mention it was typically loaded with heavier bullets as well. That meant that whatever he hit with his shots would have a higher likelihood of staying down, even if they were wearing ballistic armor. Broken bones hurt, and when your chest was shattered by the equivalent of a cannonball hitting it, whether or not the bullet got through really ceased to matter as much. He was hoping that he would be able to get off at least 2 shots before he needed to change positions. The magazine in the rifle held 5 rounds, plus there was one in the chamber just in case he had the chance for more. He had hidden plenty of guns around the place in the time since he had arrived. Now, it was just a matter of making sure he had the opportunity to use them all. Ashley would never forgive him if he didn't make it back home. Rip waited for the men to finish grabbing the last of their gear and step away from the SUVs. He wanted to make sure they were committed to this and wouldn't run at the first sign of trouble. Realistically, the chances of that happening were almost non-existent. These were trained soldiers who knew what they were getting into when they came after him. They weren't lowly gangbangers who were scared of true violence. However, even with that, he needed to be sure. There could be no chance of these people leaving and going after Ashley or Max. Unfortunately, he couldn't just take out their vehicles either. He needed them mostly functional for later. Leaving damaged SUVs out in the open would be asking for trouble and extra attention to the crime scene. He wanted them as pristine as possible, since this was not something he wanted the cleaners involved with. The soft sounds of an indistinct whispered conversation drifted across the cool spring air to his ears. A few moments later, they separated into 2 squads of 5. That was the sign that Rip had been waiting for. Keeping his scope low, he quickly bounced his aim between the 2 soldiers he was planning to shoot. Doing this enabled him to know how long it would take him to find his next target and fire. He could be a little more careful with the process if he was willing to take more time and was going for harder shots. As it was, he was unwilling to take the time, and the shots he was aiming for weren't exactly hard. Exhaling, Rip sighted down the scope and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared against his cheek and bucked against his shoulder. Keeping it under control, he angled the barrel slightly to the right. He quickly cycled the bolt action with the same hand that had pulled the trigger, tilting his head slightly away from the rifle as the brass ejected. The entire process only took a second, and then he was ready to fire again. Unfortunately, the act of slamming the bolt home had changed where he was aiming and his current target. His new target was still in the right squad though, so he decided to just say, screw it. After adjusting his aim slightly, he squeezed the trigger a second time. Over the course of 1.5, maybe 2 seconds, he had fired 2 shots into both squads of soldiers. The 2 shots he had fired weren't aimed at center mass or at their protected heads. Instead, he had chosen to take out their legs. The first shot had taken the soldier in the knee. That shot had been a near miss, instantly obliterating it and removing the lower half of the leg entirely. The second shot had been a little rushed and taken the next soldier in the thigh. The damage there was no less serious, and was probably more so considering the major artery that was in that region. Rip dropped the rifle and rolled away from it. A second later, he was behind a tree and out of sight. Bullets peppered the ground and trees around him, riddling the area with holes. An unsettled feeling began to grow in the pit of his stomach, telling him that there was something wrong with this entire situation. He couldn't place what it was, but he knew that the feeling was suddenly screaming at him. Unfortunately, he couldn't risk taking a look back at the soldiers with all the lead flying through the air. Which meant the only option he had at the moment was to crawl through the underbrush and stay as low as he possibly could. He slipped into a waist ditch moments later and finally had a chance to exhale. That had been the most dangerous part of the opening gambit. It was where he would be the most vulnerable and in the open. Now he could disappear into the shadows of the building where it would be safer. Staying in a crouch, he hurried along the waist ditch until he reached the factory. Taking a quick second to look around, he climbed out and ran toward the open door. A bullet slammed into the door as he crossed behind it. The force of the blow knocked it into his back and sent him to the floor. It hadn't been a heavy blow, so much as it was unexpected. The door was a heavy metal affair that had taken the shot without flinching. It was more impervious to bullets than the thin corrugated walls of the factory would be. Getting back to his feet, Rip shook his head and ran for his next hiding spot. He was still trying to figure out why the feeling in his chest was screaming at him. Why it was telling him that his trap for them was in turn a trap organized by them. Until he figured out what was wrong, all he could do was keep going and hope he came out on the other end in one piece. Rip made it to the second floor and into the small blind he had made earlier. It was covered in scattered pieces of metal and other debris to hide his heat signature and anything else they might be looking for. Through his scope, he watched as the first squad of now 4 men came through the door. They were careful and followed precise room-clearing maneuvers while looking for any sort of tripwire or other trap by their feet. It was the obvious location, and it was why he hadn't put one there. The grenade was instead a little farther in. The spotter took point and motioned the other 3 to remain a few steps back. It was then that Rip got the first hint of what was wrong, as he heard them talking softly in English. The soldiers were Arabic and should have been speaking in their native tongue, not in English, and especially not without any sort of accent. Gritting his teeth, he held back the inner groan. It was beginning to make sense to him now. He had wondered why they would let him pick the location like this. Why they would willingly come into an obvious trap and disadvantageous situation. It was because they were never going to. They had sent someone else to trigger the trap. They were either out there waiting until he was injured and exhausted from dealing with this group. Or worse, they weren't even here and had decided to go after Ashley and Max after all. He had been so stupid to think he had everything under control, when in reality, he was simply dancing to their tune. Why had he not just brought the fight to them? Instead, he had tried to make things complicated. Taking in a deep breath, he forced himself to calm down, and his eyes began to blaze. He might have been angry before, but now it was at a whole other level. It was time to start his hunt. And he was going to show everyone why you didn't mess with former child soldiers. They weren't known for being self-destructive and crazy pieces of shit for nothing. It was simply a matter of releasing the beast. Its leash had been lengthened in Indonesia, but it had still been on its leash. Now, he was about to let it off the proverbial leash and let them see what he had been like all those years ago. He hoped they enjoyed the show, for he doubted he would. Chapter 46. Unlike the rifle he had used outside, the one he had placed inside the blind on the second floor of the factory was fitted with a suppressor. It wasn't the strongest caliber, frankly, it was rather weak. However, just like with the .22 caliber pistol he had been using on the boat, it wasn't always about power. Precise aim counted more than anything. Or not, like in this case, when it was mainly serving as a distraction. Of course, if you could still take someone out with the shout, then so much the better. Rip carefully aimed for the soldier, or as was now more likely the case, mercenary, in the back. He would need to hit him where he wasn't protected, if he hoped to injure the man at all. The already weak bullet was going to be further weakened by the fact that he was firing the subsonic version and having it go through a suppressor. The .300 blackout caliber would be easily stopped by their ballistic armor if he missed. Breathing out, he gently squeezed the trigger and fired the rifle. The bullet took the mercenary in the throat, taking him down. The shot hadn't been properly centered, but there should have still been enough force in the bullet to damage everything even somewhat close to it. The spotter spun around and then took 2 unconscious steps back. That was all it took, and was exactly the reaction Rip had been hoping for. The heel of his boot came down on a protruding sheet of metal, one of many that were scattered around the area, and pressed it into the ground. The wire Rip had rigged to it earlier snapped, ejecting the firing pin from a nearby grenade with a shortened fuse. The mercenary barely had time to register the sound of the wire breaking, before all 4 of them detonated in a mass of blood and bones. That was 6 of the mercenaries down. There was only 1 squad of 4 left. Then he would need to find out where the Arab soldiers actually were. If they weren't here, then he would just leave the cleanup of this site to the cleaners after all. If they were here, and they were just waiting for him to show his head outside the building, then he was in trouble. As it was, he was a little more curious as to what they had told the mercs about this job. Realistically, it could have been anything. That there was a cannibal inside the building, a dangerous thief, someone from their country was being held captive inside, anything. There were any number of reasons that could have worked. Assuming the mercenaries had even asked in the first place. Money had a habit of making questions go away, after all. Shaking his head, he carefully extricated himself from the blind. Leaving the rifle behind, he instead grabbed the UTS-15 shotgun he had prepared beforehand. They weren't known as the most reliable of shotguns, but that could be taken care of with aftermarket parts if you knew what you were doing. Thankfully, the plumber, or rather the person the plumber had gotten it from, had known what they were doing. The dual 7-round magazine tubes made the shotgun an absolute beast. It was a pain to reload, but if you needed more than 14 shots in a short engagement, you probably had bigger things to worry about already. The fun thing about this particular modified shotgun was it traded between magazine tubes every time it fired. So you could have one side loaded with heavy sabot slugs, and the other with dragon's breath, and they would interchange every time you fired and racked the slide. Which is exactly what he had done. The heavy slugs packed some serious punch, and no one wanted to get hit by something that burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With the rather heavy shotgun in hand and his backup pistol and knife on his hip, Rip slinked away. His booted feet thudded softly across the grated metal that made up most of the second-floor walkways. He needed to be careful here. Unlike the people he was up against, he didn't have night vision goggles. They would be able to spot him in a second if they got the chance. Luckily, he hadn't heard any of the other doors to the building open just yet. Though that was worrying in its own right. They must have heard the grenade go off, and yet they hadn't rushed to investigate or enter the building. It was becoming more likely that this second squad was waiting for him to come out to them. He was loath to do it, especially when they would be able to see him, and the reverse wasn't true. However, he had brought this situation upon himself by trying to overcomplicate things when he should have simply kept everything simple. Now he was paying the price, at a time when he didn't have the time to waste. Well, he had been prepared to get hurt when he unleashed that side of himself earlier. Now it was time to truly let it have free rein. Rip felt his shoulders relax as he breathed out and stood up straight. A savage grin suddenly spread across his face. He jumped over the railing, onto the top of the nearest piece of machinery. From there, he hopped down to the main floor and sprinted toward the door. The metal door burst open as he hit it with his shoulder, a dull ache from the impact noted, and then thrust to the back of his mind. The useless pain had no relevance to the mission at hand, and would only hold him back at the moment if he let it. Almost immediately, the sound of gunfire lit up the night sky as two mercenaries began firing at him. There was one at each corner of the building. They were in nearly perfect placements to watch from, while waiting for him to make an appearance. Distantly, Rip felt a bullet go through his calf. It had missed the bone, but even if he ignored the pain, it would still inhibit his ability to move somewhat. It had gone through the muscle, and not just the fatty tissue. Rip aimed in the general direction of the first shooter, and squeezed the trigger. The load in the first shot was Dragon's Breath, and the night lit up with fire as everything began to burn. The mercenary didn't get out unharmed either, as the shot had a range of 200 feet and relatively little spread. So while the trees and foliage around him might have caught on fire, he had still taken a severe hit as well. Pain screams took hold of the night as the man dropped to the ground and desperately tried to stifle the fire, with little effect. The mercenary on the other side of the building yelled out in pain as his night vision goggles overloaded, not adjusting in time to the new, bright source of light. Twisting at the hip, Rip racked the slide and raised the shotgun to his shoulder. Taking careful aim, he was able to find the second shooter after just a moment of searching. The fire behind him had brightened the area considerably, and the idiot stumbling about helped as well. The sabot heavy slug used the rifling from the shotgun to maintain some accuracy. You wouldn't win any competitions with it versus a rifle, but it was plenty accurate enough to hit a man at this distance. The slug took the mercenary in his ballistic armor, and then pushed him clean off his feet and into the tree a couple of feet behind him. There would be no getting back up for him. Even if he wasn't dead already, his entire chest had just been caved in. Death wouldn't be long in coming. Rip took the brief moment of peace to bandage the hole in his calf. Just because he could ignore the pain for the moment didn't mean he wanted to be leaking his blood everywhere. Besides, the bandage would help him regain some of the mobility he had lost from the wound. Not a lot. The bullet had still gone through the muscle after all, but some, and that was better than nothing. Putting the rest of the bandage back into the pouch on his thigh, he picked up the shotgun again and hurried into the trees. Staying low in a crouch that burned far more than usual, Rip crept toward the mercenary he had blasted with the sabot slug. As soon as he got close, he could tell that the man was dead. His chest had been caved in by the heavy impact against the Kevlar he was wearing. It hadn't penetrated the armor, which in this case had resulted in far more damage to the man as a result. Of course, even if it had gone through his body with a slug that big, he still would have died. He simply would have been in less pain when the lights went out. Reaching over, he took the man's night vision goggles and slipped them onto his own head. Glancing over at the fire, he winced at how long it took the goggles to adjust to the light. This model was easily a generation or two old. The newer versions that the public knew about had nearly no adjustment period at all. Which meant that whatever the Arabs were using were probably even better. These would work for the moment. They would have to. He had nothing better to work with. From the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of highlighted movement before it was gone. One of the mercenaries was moving into position. It was lucky that he had caught sight of them when he had, otherwise he might have been caught unaware. Not. That is exactly what he was expecting them to do. Chapter 47. Rip's eyes hardened as he got back into his crouch and began creeping away. Night vision goggles work in two ways. First, by enhancing what little light there was in the surroundings and amplifying it. That meant you could use them outside even on a moonless night, since some light could always be found in the stars. However, you could not use them deep underground in a cave where there was no light to enhance. The second way was with thermal imaging, and that was the one that would get him and the mercenaries in trouble. It had been what had caused the mercenary to be highlighted a few moments earlier. Just as it was equally likely that his thermal signature had been momentarily visible to them as well. That made it hard to hide or sneak around. There were really only a few options available to him. Continue, and hope he saw the other person first, or he could simply close his eyes and pull the trigger. Closing his eyes was important, as the next shell in the chamber was a dragon's breath, and the super bright would overload the night vision sensors. The light would be painful with these old NV goggles, and would blind him if his eyes were open. Which is exactly what he was counting on, as it would do the exact same thing to the nearby mercenary. Without waiting a second longer than needed, Rip pointed the shotgun around the edge of the tree, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. The kick against his unbraced wrist, combined with the awkward angle, meant instant pain. He would be icing it for a few days after this, without a doubt. It wasn't broken, but it would definitely be sore. However, that was a trade-off he was willing to make if it meant he survived and they didn't. There was a short, muffled hiss of pain in the trees to his right and behind him, but that was it. This particular mercenary was better at controlling his responses than the one he had stolen the goggles from had been. Still, it had been enough to tell Rip the man's general location, and that was all he needed to know at the moment. Without giving the man a second more to recover, he opened his own eyes and moved from his hiding spot. Racking the slide on the shotgun, he kept to his calf-burning crouch as he wound his way through the trees. To the side, several dozen feet away, the flames from the dragon's breath he had just fired flickered and began to die. The shot burned hot and did a lot of damage, but that didn't mean it was going to start a fire. Anyone who has ever tried to start a fire could attest to that. It didn't matter how hot something was, if the circumstances weren't right, it would simply go out more often than not. These were wet woods. It was a place where even the deadfall got a fair bit of water from humidity and rain. In other words, Rip wasn't overly worried about starting a forest fire. Even the flames from the first shot he had taken had died down to embers after they had burned their way through the driest pieces in the clearing. The fires did give the area a few nice big thermal spots that he might be able to use to hide in if the situation got dire, though. For now, he was concentrating on hunting one of the two remaining mercenaries. He couldn't spend too much more time with them. He needed to get back to dealing with the Arabs and finding out where they were. If they had gone after Ashley, and sure Max as well, then he would really lose his cool. As he had thought, this mercenary was more skilled than the others, or at least better trained. He had already moved from the position Rip had heard the hiss of pain from. That didn't mean he had moved far though, only that he knew Rip was coming for him. It also meant that now he was hunting Rip instead of the other way around. It wasn't a position that he liked to be in, but it was one he was familiar with, nonetheless. Without even thinking about it, he dropped to the ground and began to roll towards the trunk of the closest tree. Getting out of sight while minimizing his profile was the first priority. Hopefully, he picked the right direction to hide in, otherwise he would be boned right away. He felt good about his chances, though. The mercenary couldn't have moved too far from his original position. He was likely hiding behind one of the thicker trees nearby as well, or he would have spotted him already. He just needed to keep his eyes open and on the swivel, and he should be able to get out of this situation alive. It would simply take a few minutes longer than he had hoped is all. Time in which the fourth mercenary would be using to flank him, or otherwise find a way to effectively attack him. The entire situation was quickly becoming less than ideal, but that was life. He simply had to deal with it and move on. There was no other choice, not if he wanted any sort of resolution to this situation. Not for the first time that night, Rip found himself regretting his choice to make everything so complicated. He had thought he was being smart at the time. Now, he couldn't help but roll his eyes at that notion. If he had been smart, then he would have taken them all out as soon as they got out of their vehicles. If he had been smart, then he would have brought the fight to them while they were still unprepared. No, he had made many mistakes during this little operation of his. Most of them were decisions that he should have known better than to make as well. A few, though, were new. Possibly, ones that could be considered common sense when thought about objectively by a normal person, but not necessarily by him. He had been raised working in a group of crazed people who were generally willing to throw their lives away at the drop of a bullet. Making all the decisions and plans, while also being forced to notice all the requisite details for those items, was new to him. It had been easier in Indonesia. Those mercenaries had barely been trained and didn't know what hit them. That was one of the items that the government training would help him with. Training that he hadn't started to receive yet. He was aware of at least some of his current weaknesses. However, simply being aware of them wasn't going to help him get out of this situation. Rip's mind began to race as he went through the possibilities of this coming encounter. No matter how he thought about it, things were not going to turn out well for him. All he was doing was wasting time with these people when the real targets were somewhere else. That realization settled it for him. It was time to disengage and leave the combat zone if possible. These people weren't the enemy, not really anyway. He needed to find the Arabs, more specifically, he needed to find Fayez. With a muted sigh, Rip reached into his pocket and pulled out the garage door opener he had found inside his new workshop. Pressing it up against the bottom of his chin, where his head could act as an antenna, he pressed the button, and then he pressed it again when the first press did nothing. The building behind him shuddered, and flames spewed out of the broken glass windows. He hadn't had enough time to put together any truly decent explosives. That was the only reason the building was still standing. Still, it was enough to serve as a distraction so he could escape. Which is exactly what he did as soon as the blast went off. He lifted up his goggles so he wouldn't be blinded, and then began running as fast as he safely could toward where he had parked his truck hours earlier. The light of the fire helped him see in the beginning, and then he had to pull down the night vision goggles so he could see again. Nevertheless, the thing he feared the most, which was a shot in the back, failed to materialize. After all of that, he couldn't exactly say that he had gotten away clean, but he had gotten away, and that was what mattered. Now he just needed to find out where they had gone. Rip pulled the shell from the chamber of the shotgun and put it back into its appropriate magazine tube as he climbed into his truck. His phone was in his hand a second later as he dialed Ashley's number. "Are you still safe?" he asked as soon as the line connected. Unfortunately, the voice he heard back was not Ashley's.